Let's take a look under the hood and make Photoshop work just for you. One note, a difference between the Mac and Windows environment is when you set your preferences on the Windows platform, you'll be going to the Edit menu and you'll find it at the bottom. On the Mac platform, that's under Photoshop Preferences, and we'll start with General. So if you're on Windows, go to Edit, Preferences, General. In the General settings, one of the things I love to turn on is Zoom with Scroll Wheel. Once that is clicked on and I hit OK, I can go to my Zoom tool and use my wheel up or wheel down to zoom in or out. If I'm back on my Move tool, it still works. So any tool you're on in Photoshop, now the wheel on your mouse will instantly react to you. And if I come up here, it's smart enough to know to zoom to that top of the wing instead of the middle of the photo. Or if I move over to her hand and wheel up, now I get the little fingers. The second preference I'm going to change is under Photoshop, Preferences, Interface, or on Windows, Edit, Preferences, Interface. Adobe made a radical change to the Photoshop's out-of-the-box interface, and now you have the option for a very dark UI, the medium dark user interface, or UI, the light, or absolute lightest. So if you really miss the older interface and you don't enjoy working in the dark, then quickly and easily change your appearance to the lightest. The second thing that you may want to customize is your user interface font size. At home, I work on a 30-inch monitor, so my resolution is super high. And often that can make the panel names over here difficult to see. Especially since I do a lot of online training, I like to set my user interface font size to medium. That way, when I say the name of a panel, they're much easier to see if I'm broadcasting and recording my screen live. It does warn me that I have to quit Photoshop for the user interface font size to change. So I'll click OK. I'll go to Photoshop, Quit Photoshop, or on the PC, File, Exit, or Quit Photoshop, and then I'll simply launch Photoshop again. Once I've launched Photoshop again, now I have my light interface, and now all of these panel names are bigger than they were previously. Let's take a look at a few other settings. Back to Photoshop, Preferences, File Handling on the Mac, or Edit, Preferences, File Handling on Windows. These two are worth their weight in gold. If you deal with enormous images, the Save dialog can be up for minutes every day. Now, automatically Save in Background is turned on by the wonderful engineers at Adobe. Save in Background will let this file save quickly and allow you to continue to work. These two features do some very advanced caching of your RAM memory and hard drive space in order to accomplish these. The second feature that I would have paid extra for years ago is automatically save recovery information. An auto recovery file is always made for every image you're working on, whether you've given it a name or not. And if you lock up, this information will come right back where you left it, depending on the interval you set it to. I find 5 minutes is most useful. Even if you lose power, it will bring up files you were working on, and once this is set to 5 minutes, that's the most time you'll ever lose. Finally, in this dialog, instead of asking me every single time if I'd like my Photoshop documents to be backward compatible with earlier versions, you can choose Maximize PSD and PSB, which are the larger or embedded Photoshop files. Maximize their compatibility always, so it never asks me again. When placing Photoshop documents into Illustrator or InDesign, it helps to have that on so they gain a good color preview. Those programs prefer it. If you only use Photoshop and you aren't sending your PSD files out to anyone else, you can actually set that to never, and your file sizes will get slightly smaller. Actually, it could be 20 to 40% smaller if you use things like smart filters. Making them backward compatible writes in enough information so that new features can be still translated to older versions of Photoshop, although you may not be able to edit those features like smart filters, which were added a few versions ago. In either case, I always set this to always because I don't like to answer dialogues where I already know it's doing the right thing. Make this backward compatible, so if I send the PSD to somebody with CS5 or CS4, yes, do that all the time. Don't ask me every time. The next preference setting I'll take a look at is in performance. I have 8 gigabytes of RAM on this machine, and I do heavy Photoshop work, so I often like to allocate 80% of my available RAM to Photoshop. Also, history states are your multiple undos, and 20 is simply not forgiving enough if you do a lot of painting or cloning. So I'm going to dial my history states up to 40 or 50. That's my preferred setting. You can actually go up to 1,000 undos, provided you have sufficient RAM. And the last thing I'll show you, I want to show you a before and after. So I'll click OK, and I'll go to my filter menu, and you'll notice that there seems like there are fewer filters. In fact, let me open an image so that you can see this. I'll pop down to Mini Bridge, and I'll open this photo with a double click. This is from my Lesson 2 folder in the Assets. I'll hit Command 0 or Control 0 so that it fits in window. And if I look at the filter menu, Browse Filters Online comes down to about the shoulder blade. If I go back to Photoshop Preferences Plugins or Edit Preferences Plugins, I can tell it to show all filter gallery groups and names in the filter menu. So when you click OK, now under Filter, Browse Filters Online hits at the top of her foot. You didn't lose any filters. All Adobe did was remove the redundant ones. Most of these filters led directly to the filter gallery. And if they're going to lead to the filter gallery anyway, and you could play with them there or turn them on there, there's no need to take up valuable screen territory with filters that show up in the filter gallery. So out of the box under Photoshop Preferences, Plugins, or on the PC, Edit Preferences Plugins, the redundant filter names are removed. This checkbox is off. If you miss them, you could turn it back on. I'll click OK. And those are most of the useful preferences that I change before I even begin working in Photoshop. I hope you've picked up a useful tip or two on how to customize Photoshop's interface as if Adobe wrote it just for you.